All right, under our talk about moon phases, we're going to talk about Egyptian gods and goddesses and how it relates to the phases of the moon. So, Egyptian beliefs are very interesting. They have many gods and goddesses and lots of crazy things going on and lots of weird stories. But I'm going to give you the main ones that are most of the Egyptologists agree on here. So, in their main belief, there were three ancient gods. There was the sky goddess, Nut. She's usually represented by a naked woman with lots of times with stars painted on her because she is the sky goddess and her name is Nut. It's spelled N-U-T. Then the air god, Shu, right here between the sky and the earth. And this is the earth god reclining down here. His name is Jeb, J-E-B. And from Jeb and Nut had children. They had 4 children. They had Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and Seth. And these 4 children ended up then having other gods, and it got more complicated. Now, what was kind of weird is they had no problem with brothers and sisters marrying because Osiris and Isis became husband and wife, and they had children, and they were brother and sister as well. And Nephthys and Seth were also brother and sister and were married. Okay? Now, if you look, here is another representation of it, where here is the sky goddess Nut. This is Jeb down here. This is a pharaoh. They often represent a pharaoh in a boat because the boat was the means of transportation at that time and how they were in this world. Now, a few other things I want to point out here too. Did you see this symbol right here with the circle on top? It looks like a cross with the circle on top. That's called an Ankh, an A-N-K-H. Very important. It's a way that power could be bestowed, but it also represents many different things to them, and lots of people will wear necklaces and things that have that symbol on them. The other thing I want you to see is this symbol right here. You see this? It's also the same symbol here. This is the Eye of Horus. So the question is, who is Horus? And we will get to that right here. But before we get to do that, this is from the Book of the Dead, which is a real thing. There is the Book of the Dead from the Egyptians. And you see here, this is the sky goddess Nut up here. This is the sky goddess Nut down here. Same sky goddess, but this is during the daytime. The sun goes across her sky, pulled by the god Ra, as he goes across the sky in his chariot, taking it across the sky. And then they believe the sun would die every night, and the sky god Ra would have to fight a great snake called Apophis, and he'd have to beat the snake, and then the sun would come back the next day. It was never guaranteed, but the sun always came back. But at night, her body was covered in stars. So here she is at night. And these are different gods and goddesses and pharaohs and serpents. And remember, the pharaohs were actually gods. They were gods on earth. All right. The Eye of Horus. So who is Horus? Osiris and Isis had 4 children. The 2 most important ones were Horus and Hathor, which were brother and sister. They also got married and had children. But Horus, what happened is, one of the stories is that Osiris was murdered by his brother Seth. Seth was the bad, mischievous god, and he murdered Osiris and cut up his body and spread it all over Egypt. And Horus, actually Isis, went back, found all his body parts, put them back together, and resurrected him. And then she laid with him, and that one night after his resurrected body, and they had a son, Horus. Horus then later came back and avenged his father's death. So Horus actually becomes the main god that most of the pharaohs pray to. And the Eye of the Horus, this is the Eye of Horus, represents good things. It represents healing, restoration, reestablishment, and it does rebirth and regeneration. So it's a symbol often used, especially in tombs, when they're trying to symbol rebirth. It also can be representative of moon, the moon phases. And I'll show you that in some of their places here. So here you see on the Temple of Hathor, which I'm going to show you more pictures of in a second, is that on this ship here, there are exactly 14 gods. By the way, I should tell you, Hathor is usually represented by a guy with a falcon head. That's a Horus. Okay? But there are 14, 7 on the top, 7 on the bottom. And down here there are 14. This also goes to the Eye of Horus and the disc. That disc represents the full moon. So this represents the full moon. The ascending staircase shows that there are 14 gods ascending. That represents the 14 days going from when you can't see the moon, when it's new, until it becomes full moon. Okay? And then you could have descending ones, and it would be the waning moon, or the moon getting smaller, representing the disk going back to zero again, representing the Eye of Horus here. So we look for those symbols in the Egyptian temples. All right, so first we're going to go to the Temple of Edfu. Edfu here was built between around 57 and 237 BC, or BCE I should say, and it was dedicated to the god Horus. Now it has undergone a lot of damage in the time. What you'll see as I show you more pictures of it here is that when they tried to convert Egypt to Christianity and to Muslim religions, they didn't like the old gods, so they took chisels to a lot of the faces of them. But this represents right here, this represents Osiris in the middle, the god of the afterlife, and this is the representation of Horus marrying his sister Hathor. And every year they would have a holiday, a celebration, where Horus and Hathor's marriage would occur. And this is him putting them together as in a wedding vow. These are called cartouches. Those are the names of the gods, and that is the Egyptian written language explaining what is going on here. Hathor, his sister, is often represented by the bull horns and the full disc, or the disc of the sun. Here it is again. This is supposed to be showing a battle where this is Hathor here and is coming to help the Pharaoh as the Pharaoh overtakes his enemies. They would oftentimes make the sizes different because the sizes represented your status. So this, even though the enemy here is small, they weren't smaller, but compared to the power of the Pharaoh, they were significantly smaller. Notice they traveled by boats. Notice they were all pecked away, especially the faces of them, because they were supposedly evil images not to be seen. Inside the Temple of Edfu, they have this symbolic boat. Remember, boats were their means of getting up and down because Egypt existed essentially because the Nile was there. And so the boats were the main means of transportation. And so boats were representation of not only transportation on the earth, but if you're going to transport yourself to the afterlife, you also had to do it using a boat, because that's what they thought of. And we talked about that by the pyramids, that there were 2 large perfect boats that had never been used that were buried with the pyramids to allow the Pharaoh to be transported to the afterlife. All right. Then further up the Nile, these are all up the Nile, these are all further south than the pyramids. This is the Temple of Dendera, and they were later in time. Okay, I remember the pyramids were way back about 2500 BC. Then there was a big gap when they were burying all the pharaohs out in the Valley of the Kings. And then they had these temples. These were the temples that they worshipped at along the Nile. The Temple of Dendera, this was built about 1 BCE. And it's kind of in rough shape now, but this is what's left of it. All these faces on here are the faces of Hathor. Okay? And all these on all 4 sides of all the pillars. And when you get inside, I'll show you inside, it's all pillars with her faces on it. So her face was all over this temple. This was a temple dedicated area. Here you can see from the inside all the pillars, but her face is on every side. But again, they pecked away her face on every single one of them. And these were elaborate stories that were written around here. It talks about the gods, all kinds of things. All of the columns and all of the ceiling had their hieroglyphs. It's a wonderful place to have the whole Egyptian mythology laid out for you. This is in the this is in Temple of Dendera, and you can see this is the Eye of Horus with the 14 gods ascending the staircase. to the full moon disk representing Horus right here. So that is very symbolic of the moon phases. Okay, this shows, this is still in the Temple of Dendera, that this is the pharaoh. You see the pharaoh right here. Okay, and so this is a new pharaoh. And the new pharaoh, once you become pharaoh, then you're given power by the gods. And these are all different gods giving you power here. Okay? And when they give you power through the Ankh. See the Ankh shape right there. So the Ankh is used to transmit the power of the gods to the pharaoh. So the different pharaohs getting power from each of the different gods so that he can rule on earth. And then eventually when he dies, he will go into the afterlife and he will continue to rule in the afterlife. This is symbols here. This is Hathor right here. You can see by the horns and the disc. This is the pharaoh. The pharaoh is coming giving sacrifices or, whatever to oblations to the goddess Hathor so that he will succeed and do well as the pharaoh. So the gods will be on his side. This is on the ceiling of the Temple of Dendera. This is the sky goddess Nut over here. You can see in her naked body as she's over the top. But this is a star chart. This is their constellations. And some of their constellations are similar to ones we have nowadays, but some of them are very different. They have a hippo. They have the leg of a bull. And you see these four goddesses here. These represent the cardinal points, and they're holding up the sky. And so these are the Egyptian constellations. Now we already knew a few of them. Instead of Orion, they had Osiris. And instead of Sirius, they had Isis. All right. I'm going to